Welcome, everyone. We're doing a deep dive today into something that, well, it shapes our lives every single day, but we rarely stop to really think about it. The news.
Right. It feels so familiar, almost mundane.
Exactly. But it's so much more than just headlines, isn't it? It's this really deep, complex relationship we have with information, with society.
Absolutely. And you've gathered some fantastic reflections on this. Our mission today really is to unpack that relationship,
Yeah, we want to get into what the news actually is, trace its really fascinating history, look at what happens if it's not there.
which is a scary thought experiment in itself.
Totally. And then tackle the pressures and maybe even the performances that define how we deal with news today.
Get ready for some perhaps surprising connections. How information, emotion, identity, it all gets tangled up in current events.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. What is the news, fundamentally?
Well, at its core, it's information about current events. Simple enough, right? But the crucial part, the part that's really interesting, is that it's curated information.
Curated, meaning someone is choosing what we see and how we see it.
Precisely. That whole process, the selection, the framing, how it's disseminated, that tells you so much about a society. Its values, its power structures, the technology it uses. It's like a mirror, in a way.
Okay, so if news is this curated flow of information, what about the bigger picture? Mass communication, what's its purpose beyond just telling us stuff?
Right. Mass communication broadly is transmitting information, ideas, messages to huge, scattered audiences. Think newspapers, radio, TV, the internet.
All the channels.
Exactly. And it serves, well, scholars often point to 6 core purposes. Of course, there's informing the basic facts, the updates,
Got it.
and educating, giving context, helping us understand why things are happening.
Makes sense.
Then there's persuading, influencing beliefs, attitudes, maybe behaviors. Think editorials, ad campaigns, even propaganda falls under this.
Okay, that one's pretty clear. What about the others, maybe the less obvious ones?
Yeah, this is where it gets more interesting. There's entertaining, think talk shows, satirical news programs. They blend amusement with awareness. It's not always dry facts.
Right, news is entertainment.
Then mobilizing, getting people to act, wartime broadcasts, urging support, calls to protest, get out the vote campaigns.
Using news to spur action.
Exactly. And finally, maybe the deepest one, social integration. This is about creating shared stories, shared emotions. Think about how a nation feels united during a major crisis or a celebration or even a tragedy.
That collective experience, like everyone watching the moon landing, maybe.
Perfect example. It creates that sense of we're all in this together, for good or ill. It weaves the social fabric.
That's a really powerful framework. So knowing those purposes, how did we actually get here? The journey of news itself must be incredible.
Oh, it's a wild ride. Think way back before writing, oral cultures. News was word of mouth. Storytellers, town criers, elders.
And trust was everything, right? You had to trust the messenger.
Completely. No documents to check. Then, fast forward to ancient civilizations, Egypt, China, Rome. We start seeing written records, public notices, official bulletins.
Like the Acta Diurna in Rome?
Exactly. 59 BCE. Often state-controlled, mind you, carved in stone, maybe distributed on scrolls. So news and power were linked from the very start.
And then, boom, the printing press. That must have changed absolutely everything. What was the biggest impact there?
Gutenberg, 1440s. Mass replication became possible, pamphlets, early newspapers. But the key shift, the truly profound one, news became a commodity.
Something you could buy and sell.
For the first time, really. It started with the elites, people who could read and afford it, but gradually spread. The first actual newspaper, The Relation, pops up in Strasbourg in 1605. Information wasn't just passed down, it was packaged and sold.
That's a huge mental shift. Okay, jump forward again, 19th century. Industrial Revolution, the telegraph, how did that accelerate things?
Massively. You had rising literacy rates and incredibly fast communication. The telegraph, from the 1840s, suddenly, real-time recording across huge distances was possible.
Wow, instant news.
Pretty much. And newswires like the Associated Press started pooling resources. Newspapers became these incredibly powerful institutions, shaping politics, business, public opinion like never before. They really cemented their role.
So the telegraph brought speed, then radio and TV arrived in the 20th century. How did they change the feel of news, bringing it into our homes?
That was huge. News became way more emotive, more personal. It was in your living room. Anchors became these trusted figures, almost part of the family for some people.
You felt like you knew them.
Exactly. And TV especially brought visual storytelling. That introduced all sorts of new biases, tone, style, the anchor's charisma definitely fueled some sensationalism.
Yeah, you can see that.
But it also created those powerful moments of national unity we talked about. The moon landing, the JFK assassination coverage, millions sharing an experience visually and emotionally.
And then came the digital tsunami, the 21st century. Social media. What's the headline for news now?
Chaos, maybe. Huh? No, seriously, it's radical decentralization and speed. And fragmentation. Everyone can be a publisher now. The old gatekeepers. Their power is seriously eroded.
So anyone can broadcast anything.
Pretty much. And algorithms rule the roost. They prioritize engagement clicks, shares, outrage, often over accuracy. Misinformation can spread like wildfire, sometimes faster than the truth.
And the lines blur.
Completely. News blurs into opinion, into identity signaling, memes, activism, entertainment. It's incredibly hard to navigate to know what's reliable, what's true. It really complicates our trust.
So if we try to wrap that historical journey up, what's our working definition of news now?
I'd say news is a socially and technologically mediated process. It's about identifying, framing, and distributing information that's seen as relevant or urgent or important to the public. But crucially, it's as much about power and perspective as it is about objective facts.
Okay. That sets the stage perfectly. So what happens if that whole system, flawed as it might be, just isn't there? What are the consequences for a community without news? Is ignorance always bad?
That's a fascinating question. Let's start with the individual mind. Psychologically, without external news sources, you're relying mostly on your own limited experience, right? Or maybe unverifiable gossip, or just gut feelings, which are often wrong.
So you're more vulnerable.
Highly vulnerable to cognitive biases, definitely, to conspiracy thinking because you lack broader context. And even to what psychologists call moral disengagement, it's easier to ignore problems if you don't know about them.
And emotionally. What does that do to us?
It can lead to a kind of emotional narrowness.
Yep.
If you're only exposed to your immediate circle, your empathy might not develop as fully for outsiders. You can get moral insularity where only your local norms seem to matter. A smaller range of emotional complexity, perhaps.
Interesting. You also mentioned a false sense of security.
Yeah, that's a big one. Ignorance can feel safe. If I don't hear about the bad stuff, it can't hurt me. But that's an illusion, right? When a crisis inevitably hits a pandemic, an economic downturn, whatever that peace shatters fast. Especially if awareness could have helped you prepare.
Okay, that's the individual. What about society? A whole culture without those shared signals from news?
Societally, it's disastrous. You lose the shared narrative. How do you coordinate disaster response? How do you run elections fairly? How do you get public health alerts out? It becomes almost impossible.
And what fills that vacuum?
Usually nothing good. Authoritarian control often steps in because they can control the limited information flow. Or maybe religious fundamentalism, folklore treated as fact. Powerful corporations shaping the narrative unopposed, even celebrity ideologies.
And democracy.
It breaks down. A free press is often called the fourth estate. For a reason, it's supposed to check power. Without news, elites operate with impunity, corruption thrives, and citizens literally cannot make informed choices.
And you mentioned social fragmentation earlier.
Yes. Without that common ground of information, people just drift into their own little bubbles, their micro worlds of belief. Echo chambers harden, community bonds weaken, suspicion between groups grows. It's incredibly divisive.
So this really brings up the moral side. When is ignorance actually wrong? And when is it?
Sure.
Maybe just understandable or even unavoidable?
That's the critical distinction. Ignorance is a moral problem when it's willful. Choosing not to know because the truth is uncomfortable or inconvenient, like maybe ignoring climate change because changing your lifestyle is hard.
Or when it harms others.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Directly or passively, like not bothering to learn about voting restrictions that disenfranchise people and then not acting. That passive acceptance of harm is problematic.
But sometimes ignorance isn't a choice, right?
Absolutely. Cognitive overload is a real thing, especially today. You simply cannot pay attention to everything. Some degree of ignorance is necessary just for mental health, for sanity.
And lack of access.
Crucial point. Poverty, lack of literacy, government censorship. These create structural barriers to information. In those cases, ignorance isn't a personal failing. It's a result of the system.
And that system itself can engineer ignorance.
Oh, definitely. Through deliberate media suppression or algorithmic filtering that only shows you what you already believe, or just cultural conditioning that discourages asking certain questions. When ignorance is manufactured like that, the blame shifts heavily towards the system, not just the individual.
So the big picture.
A community without news isn't just uninformed, it's basically unarmed. It can't reason together, it can't defend itself from manipulation, it struggles to grow morally or culturally. But we have to be careful not to blame individuals when ignorance might be a symptom of overload or constraint.
That's a really important nuance. Okay, let's pivot back to the news we do have. We get hit with so much at different scales, different types. Can you break down those levels first?
Sure, you can generally think of three main scales. First, local news. This is your community stuff. City council decisions, local crime reports, school board meetings, maybe the weather that affects your commute.
Feels very immediate, very relevant.
Exactly. But ironically, it's often the most neglected, the most underfunded part of the news ecosystem today.
Right. Then what's next?
National news. This is focused on federal politics, big policy debates, national trends like inflation or election results, major disasters that affect the whole country. It shapes the national conversation, the sense of national identity.
Okay. And the biggest scale?
Global news. International relations, wars, treaties, humanitarian crises, pandemics like COVID, obviously big economic shifts, climate change, stuff that happens out there.
But it doesn't always feel distant anymore, does it?
Not at all. It's increasingly tied to our daily lives. Think supply chains, global warming impacts, refugees. And these levels constantly interact, right? A virus starting in one city becomes global news, then national, then local, practically overnight.
That ripple effect. Okay, so those are the scales. What about the different flavors or categories of news we see? They seem to hit different emotional buttons.
Totally. These categories often blend, but they do serve different functions and evoke different feelings. Think about politics. That's power, policy, governing. Often stirs up outrage, concern, maybe loyalty to your side.
Yep, feel that one.
Crime and safety.
Yeah.
That touches on protection, justice, law and order. Usually triggers fear, anger, maybe morbid curiosity.
Okay, what else?
Science and medicine, discovery, innovation, but also health risks. That can bring wonder, caution, sometimes confusion if it's complex.
Like vaccine news, for instance.
Perfect example. Then you have natural disasters.
Yeah.
Focuses on survival, empathy, preparedness. Often brings grief, but also solidarity.
Right. And lighter stuff, too.
Sure. Sports, competition, identity, ritual, loads of pride, disappointment, tribalism, tech and innovation, disruption, convenience, looking to the future, often excitement mixed with anxiety.
Technology always seems double-edged.
Doesn't it? Then entertainment. Leisure, aspiration, celebrity culture, spectacle. Can be joy, envy, sometimes just detachment.
Escapism.
Yeah. Business and economy, systems, trends, personal finance. Often stress, hope, maybe strategic thinking, human interest. Those inspiring stories, local heroes, quirky oddities. Usually warmth, curiosity.
I like those ones.
Me too. And finally, culture and identity. Exploring meaning, community, values. This can bring pride, but also conflict, reflection. These aren't just journalistic beats, you know.
Yeah.
They're entry points for our emotions, how we build our worldview, even how we form our moral sense.
That's a great way to frame it. Okay, so we have all these levels, all these flavors, which brings us to the huge challenge, actually consuming it all. Time, bandwidth, relevance. It feels impossible to stay truly informed.
It practically is. Think about it. To really stay fully informed, tracking all major developments in every category across local, national, and global scales, you'd need, what, 8, 10 hours a day? Maybe more?
A full-time job, easily.
And that's just consuming. Not even counting the time to verify information, especially conflicting reports, or to contextualize it, or just to emotionally process some of the heavy stuff.
So what's the reality for most people?
The reality. Most people snatch maybe 15 minutes, maybe 45 minutes a day for news. Often passively, scrolling on their phone, maybe half listening to the radio or TV.
It's often background noise.
Or infotainment, filtered snippets, not deep dives. And there's a limit to our emotional bandwidth too, right? We just can't absorb endless tragedy or complexity without burning out. Mental exhaustion is real.
So, given we have limited time and energy, what actually matters? How do we figure out what's relevant versus what just grabs our attention?
Okay, that's the million-dollar question. There's stuff that's directly relevant. Local laws changing, public health warnings, major economic shifts affecting your job, severe weather alerts, things impacting your immediate safety and decisions.
Okay, need to know stuff.
Right. Then there's contextually important news. Big national policy changes, major elections, scientific breakthroughs, shifts in technology. These shape the world you live in, your future, but maybe don't require constant minute-by-minute tracking.
Important, but less urgent day to day.
Exactly. Then you've got news that's emotionally resonant but distant. Celebrity gossip, complex global politics in a region you're not connected to, social movements happening far away. These might spark your interest, shape your values maybe, but they don't usually affect your daily functioning unless you have a deep personal investment.
The traps.
Ah, yes, the attention traps. Clickbait headlines designed purely to make you click. Rage cycles fueled by polarizing content. The fleeting trend of the week drama that feels huge but vanishes by Friday.
Stuff that feels urgent but isn't important.
Precisely. Low signal-to-noise ratio. It steals your focus, your emotional energy, without actually enriching your understanding. And here's the hard truth. Most of what's presented as news probably isn't directly relevant to your daily survival or core decision-making.
But it feels relevant.
It feels relevant because it's emotionally charged, it's amplified by algorithms designed for engagement, and it's socially contagious. Everyone's talking about it, so you feel you need to know, too. Our brains are kind of being hijacked for clicks and shares.
That really leads us into the modern media landscape itself. Propaganda, systemic issues. It sounds like the burden today isn't just finding news, but navigating this incredibly complex, often manipulative environment.
The burden is immense. It's not just reading anymore. It's like being a detective all the time. You're tracking multiple sources, trying to decode the bias or the agenda behind each one, fact-checking claims, noticing what isn't being said.
Identifying the missing pieces.
Right. Distinguishing fact from opinion, spotting satire before you share it as real, recognizing sponsored content disguised as news. The true cost of being informed isn't 30 minutes of reading. It's potentially hours of critical thinking, of layered judgment.
It's work.
It's serious mental labor. News isn't just passively consumed. It has to be actively filtered, compared, interpreted, contextualized. It's almost like needing a PhD in media literacy just to get through the day.
So given that environment, let's talk propaganda. What does that even mean today? It's not just old school government posters, is it?
Not at all. It's much slipperier now. Fundamentally, propaganda is information designed to manipulate you, often by appealing directly to your emotions, that's pathos, or maybe leaning on authority figures' ethos while deliberately suppressing counterarguments or complexity.
And it comes from everywhere.
Everywhere. It can be corporate greenwashing ads. It can be partisan cable news channels creating echo chambers. It can be ideological, framing everything through a culture war lens. It can even be grassroots but wrong, viral misinformation spreading through communities.
And algorithmic.
Absolutely. Platforms promoting content simply because it gets a lot of engagement, regardless of whether it's true or harmful. And with the explosion of sources. Every influencer is a potential broadcaster, every tweet a potential headline. Platforms can twist reach and reality based on what keeps eyeballs glued.
So we don't just have too much news.
We have too many competing versions of reality. It's incredibly disorienting.
You mentioned pathos and ethos. Can you unpack how those are used, maybe overpowering logos or logic, like with a really charged headline?
Okay, think about a headline like, "They're coming for your kids." It's incredibly potent, right? It bypasses logic entirely.
Instantly triggers fear, protection.
Exactly. Pure pathos hitting your deepest protective instincts. It also implies the speaker has some special insights, some moral high ground that's ethos. It feels urgent. It activates your nervous system. Compare that to a nuanced article with data and context logos. That takes time for critical thinking.
This doesn't spread as fast.
Not even close. Emotionally viral content is built for speed and depth of impact. Nuance is slow, often requires background knowledge. In the attention economy, emotion often wins.
And what are the underlying reasons for this? The systemic incentives. Why is the news landscape built this way?
It boils down to a few key drivers. First, ad-based economics. Most news outlets, especially online, survive by selling attention to advertisers. Clicks, shares, time spent on site. Those are the metrics that drive revenue, not necessarily the quality or truth of the reporting.
So attention is the real product.
Pretty much. Second, engagement algorithms. Social media platforms and search engines are designed to keep you hooked. They reward content that's provocative, polarizing, highly emotional, because that stuff gets reactions. Nuance doesn't generate clicks as reliably, so it often gets buried. Falsehoods can actually be cheaper to produce and spread faster than carefully verified truth.
That's alarming.
It is. And third, political and corporate influence. Sponsors, big donors, parent companies, they can subtly or not so subtly shape the editorial slant. Politicians depend heavily on media to frame narratives in their favor. Even journalists trying to do good work might self-censor sometimes to maintain access or avoid massive online backlash.
These aren't just glitches, then. They're features of the system.
Exactly. These are structural incentives baked deep into the modern media economy. It's not necessarily that everyone is acting in bad faith. It's that the system rewards certain behaviors, prioritizing speed, emotion, and engagement over others, like accuracy, depth, and careful consideration.
So the conclusion is,
Yeah.
this is systemic. This isn't just a few bad apples.
Yes. I think you have to say it's deeply dangerously systemic. We're living in an information environment where emotion often travels faster and further than reason, where speed is valued over accuracy, and where powerful economic and political pressures distort the incentives for producing and sharing information.
And the burden falls on us, the consumers.
Largely, yes. We're forced to become our own editors, fact-checkers, ethicists. And the results are pretty clear. Increasing polarization, widespread misinformation, constant crisis fatigue, and a deep erosion of trust in almost all institutions, very much including the media itself.
So the system isn't broken.
In many ways, it's working exactly as designed to capture, hold, and monetize our attention in a fiercely competitive market. Often, collective understanding and truth are just collateral damage.
Wow. That's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
Makes me think about how we interact with news, not just consuming it, but talking about it. Is there an ego element there? Like, we share news to show we're smart or informed.
Oh, absolutely. You're hitting on something crucial there. We don't just share news articles or talk about current events purely to inform others. Very often, it's about performance.
Performance?
Yeah, performing knowledge, showing we're in the know, signaling which political or social tribe we belong to, impressing people with our insight or our access to certain kinds of information. Sociologists call this using cultural capital knowledge as a form of social currency.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Saying something like, oh, I read this piece in The Atlantic that signals a certain intellectual leaning, right? Or asking, did you see what so-and-so tweeted about the Supreme Court decision? Signals your political awareness and probably your alignment. Even just saying, well, actually, the data shows, can be less about the data and more about performing superiority.
So it's not always about the content, but the act of sharing.
Often, yes. We're performing literacy, performing engagement, performing allegiance.
What about that feeling when you've just skimmed a headline or watched a quick explainer video and suddenly you feel like you really get a complex issue? Is that related?
Totally related. That's often called the illusion of explanatory depth. We skim, we watch a 3-minute TikTok breakdown, we absorb a friend's confident take, and then we feel this surge of confidence like we're practically experts.
Even though we probably couldn't explain it properly if pushed.
Exactly. Psychologists find people vastly overestimate their understanding of complex systems until you actually ask them to explain the mechanics step by step. Then the illusion evaporates. It creates this kind of epistemic ego. I heard a good summary, therefore I understand it deeply.
And jargon plays into this, too.
That's right.
Yeah, using those buzzwords.
Big time. Jargon can be like armor and ornament. It can protect you from scrutiny. Oh, this is very technical. You wouldn't understand. And it makes you sound smart or like you belong to a certain sophisticated group.
Like throwing around terms.
Like intersectionality or neoliberalism or late-stage capitalism, gaslighting, equity versus equality. Now, these are real terms with specific meanings, but in everyday chat, they often get used as these half-understood shibboleths. It's less about genuine insight and more about signaling you're part of the right conversation, you know, the code words.
Winning social points, basically.
Yeah, sounding in the know, often without really knowing.
So what's the bigger impact of all this? When news becomes less about understanding the world and more about performing identity.
Well, several things happen. First, we start mistaking fluency for wisdom. Being able to talk about something isn't the same as understanding it deeply or having the humility to know your limits.
We reward the performance.
We reward performative intelligence over genuine, honest curiosity. Think about it. In many online spaces, asking a basic, sincere question feels riskier than just confidently repeating a popular take, even if it's half-baked.
And we end up in echo chambers.
Absolutely. Echo chambers of regurgitated thought. If news is mostly secondhand stories, filtered through biased sources, amplified by influencers, condensed into memes, our discourse becomes this collage of borrowed opinions, not original thinking.
And maybe the most critical point.
We start confusing news fluency with actual virtue. Being informed starts to feel like this moral accomplishment. But often, informed just means you know the talking points of your particular in-group.
It sounds like so much of our conversation about news isn't really about finding truth, but about reinforcing our identity, managing our ego, feeling like we belong.
That's a huge part of it. We talk about the news to sound like the kind of people who care, who are smart, who are on the right side. Recognizing that pattern isn't about cynicism, it's about opportunity. We can choose a different way.
Like asking more questions.
Asking more questions, admitting what we don't know, prioritizing genuine understanding over just looking smart.
Which brings us perfectly to the so what? What do we do with all this? The goal isn't self-flagellation, right? It's about noticing the complexity and trying to be more intentional.
Exactly. We shouldn't just unplug or stop consuming news altogether. Information is a gift. It's vital for a functioning society. But it becomes a trap when our feeds are designed to provoke us emotionally, when our conversations become ego contests, when our opinions are shaped more by fleeting vibes than solid understanding.
So it's not about consuming less necessarily, but consuming differently.
Consuming more consciously. Being aware of how information is filtered before it reaches you, how it's framed, how it makes you feel, and then how you choose to forward it or talk about it. It's less about what you know and more about how you carry what you know.
Okay, so practical steps. You mentioned feelings. Checking your emotional thermometer when you engage with news.
Crucial step. Ask yourself, how is this making me feel? Am I feeling fear, outrage, a sense of superiority, maybe guilt? Is this content provoking me, pushing my buttons? Or is it genuinely inviting me to understand something complex?
And why does that emotional check matter so much?
Because emotion is incredibly contagious, especially online. How we feel when we read or watch something heavily influences how and if we share it. If we're not aware of that, we can easily end up spreading panic or bitterness or tribalism, all while thinking we're just sharing important information.
Okay, emotional check. What else? Checking the mirror, am I repeating or reflecting?
Yeah, we all do it sometimes, right? Repeat a hot take we heard, quote, a study we haven't actually read, share something just because everyone else in our feed is sharing it, or because it makes us look smart or virtuous.
So pause and ask.
Pause and ask, am I really processing this or just reposting it? Do I understand the core issue here? Could I explain this, in my own words, to someone who disagrees with me? What actually qualifies me to have a strong opinion on this? And importantly, when is the wisest thing to do? Just listen more.
That pause sounds key. Not necessarily to silence yourself, but to ensure integrity.
Exactly. Sharpening our own integrity before we broadcast something.
You also mentioned watching for guilt, shame, or ego inflation. How does that play in?
Well, sometimes we share news about crises because it makes us feel morally involved, like we're doing something. Or we express performative outrage to prove we care. Or maybe we avoid certain topics altogether because they make us feel guilty or powerless.
That all sounds very human.
It is. It's totally human. But if our inner world just becomes this constant swirl of feeling important because we're aware, or guilty because we're not doing enough, or exhausted by it all, we lose sight of the real goals. Clarity, genuine understanding, and constructive action. Feeling informed isn't the virtue.
What is that?
Acting with wisdom, with compassion, because of what you've learned. That's the aim.
So how do we cultivate that more virtuous approach? More humility, compassion, integrity?
Yeah.
What does that look like day to day?
Okay, practically, humility means admitting I don't know more often, asking genuine questions before rushing to judgment.
Okay.
Compassion means actively trying to consider the human beings affected by the news, not just seeing statistics or abstract issues.
Seeing the people behind the story.
Yes. Curiosity means seeking out different perspectives, even ones that make you uncomfortable, digging deeper than just the headlines or the summary.
Resisting the easy take.
Right. Integrity means having a personal policy, maybe. Don't share it if you haven't read it, or at least seriously reflected on it. Don't amplify things you don't understand.
That's a tough one in the age of the quick share.
It is. And finally, courage, which means speaking up when your voice can genuinely add value or clarity or care, but also having the courage to be quiet when adding more noise would be harmful, or when listening is the more helpful action.
So it's less about quantity, more about quality of engagement.
Exactly. Cultivating that internal discipline. Being willing to sit with complexity instead of demanding simple answers. Resisting that cheap certainty that feels good but isn't true. Staying grounded in a genuine purpose to understand, to connect, to help rather than just performing knowledge.
Okay, that's a powerful call to intention. But let's complicate things a bit, as reality always does. We talked about performance being potentially problematic. But is performance always bad?
That's a great complication. Because, no, probably not always. Think about it. Public performance can actually help normalize positive values. When people publicly signal support for, say, climate action or social justice, even if it's partly performative for some, it can still build social momentum. It makes those values more visible, more mainstream.
So acting informed could sometimes lead to becoming informed.
It can. Sometimes it's a fake it till you make it kind of thing in civic life. It might start as wanting to fit in or look good, but that can be a scaffold that leads to deeper engagement, genuine learning, or finding solidarity with others. It's not always nefarious.
Okay. And we talked about humility. But can too much humility be a problem? Can it lead to silence when action is needed?
Absolutely. That inner critic saying, "Who am I to speak? I'm not an expert," can become paralyzing. If only the supremely confident or the credential feel allowed to speak, you might silence crucial grassroots perspectives or necessary dissent.
We lose valuable voices.
Exactly. So we need that balance. Intellectual humility, yes, but also ethical courage. Knowing when your perspective, even if imperfect, needs to be shared to add care or clarity, even if you don't have all the answers. It's not about waiting for perfection.
And emotions, we critiqued how news manipulates them. But emotions aren't inherently bad either, are they? Outrage at injustice seems pretty important.
Totally valid and important. Grief in response to tragedy, pride in human achievement, these are fundamental human responses. They connect us, they motivate us. Calling for purely rational, logos-driven engagement can be a problem in itself.
How so?
Well, it can sometimes unintentionally dismiss or erase the lived, felt experience of marginalized groups whose knowledge is often deeply emotional before it's articulated in academic terms. The goal isn't less emotion, it's better discernment about our emotions.
Asking, is this feeling helpful or is it hijacking me?
Precisely. Is it leading me toward constructive action or just toward more spectacle and noise?
Okay, another tension. The ideal of being fully informed. We kind of internalize this pressure, right? But you argued earlier it's basically impossible.
It really is a trap. This assumption that a good citizen reads widely, knows every angle, is constantly up to date. In today's fire hose of information, it's completely unrealistic. And the line between being well-informed and being anxiously addicted to the news cycle is incredibly thin.
Chasing it leads to burnout.
Burnout, or maybe just performing knowledge to cope with the feeling of overwhelm. The truth is, in this fragmented media world, no one is fully informed about everything. And maybe striving for that is counterproductive.
So maybe focused ignorance is okay sometimes.
I think it can be virtuous, strategically choosing to tune out some of the noise, to ignore certain trends or dramas, so you can actually go deeper on the few issues you truly care about or can impact. Depth over breadth.
That leads to another really interesting point. Is our idea of virtuous news consumption itself kind of class-filtered, privileged?
That's a really important critique to consider. Yes, I think it often is. When we talk about mindful engagement, deep reading, seeking multiple perspectives, checking sources, all good things, we're often implicitly assuming the person has the time, the literacy skills, the reliable internet access, maybe the educational background to do that easily.
The cultural capital we talked about earlier.
Exactly. For someone working 2 jobs, dealing with trauma, lacking stable housing or internet, the expectation to practice deep news engagement with compassion might feel like a completely unaffordable luxury.
So judging someone's ignorance might miss their reality.
Absolutely. Their apparent ignorance might reflect survival priorities, not apathy or intellectual laziness. Virtue has to be contextual, and it means the burden for clarity can't just be on individual consumers. It also requires systemic reforms, better media literacy education, platforms designed for health, not just engagement, support for local journalism.
It's a shared responsibility.
It has to be.
Okay, this leads to a final, maybe meta-level thought. In trying so hard to approach news virtuously, do we risk turning virtue itself into just another performance, another identity badge?
That is the ultimate tightrope walk, isn't it? The risk is definitely there. We can become performatively humble, performatively compassionate, performatively critical. The goal, perhaps, isn't to somehow transcend performance entirely. Maybe that's impossible in social life.
So what is the goal then?
Maybe it's about aligning our performance as much as possible with authentic care and genuine intention. Moving from primarily wanting to appear good or smart or informed towards genuinely wanting to serve Well, serve truth, serve understanding, serve connection, serve justice.
Lining the inner and the outer.
Something like that. Because in this world, just saturated with headlines and hot takes and half-truths, our relationship with news, it's not just informational anymore. It's gone way deeper. It's psychological, it's social, it's profoundly moral.
We're not just reading about the world.
We're filtering it, feeling it, performing it, sometimes projecting ourselves onto it through that act of reading and sharing.
So the real question we should be asking ourselves isn't just, are you informed?
No. Perhaps the more vital question is, how are you being shaped by what you consume? And how are you shaping others by what you choose to share?
That's powerful. We've covered so much ground today.
We really have, from the evolution of news oral stories to algorithmic chaos, the psychological costs overload, anxiety, that illusion of expertise, the social dynamics, status, performance, tribalism, the moral tightropes, empathy versus ego, responsibility versus burnout, and those deep systemic distortions from platforms, profit motives, propaganda.
And we asked, what would a healthier way forward look like? Consuming and communicating with more humility, more clarity, more care, more courage.
Maybe it means consciously replacing some of those instant hot takes with honest, thoughtful questions. Sharing things not primarily to impress people, but maybe to invite genuine reflection.
Letting go of that need to be in the know about everything, all the time.
Practicing what some call compassionate skepticism, doubting claims kindly and constructively, not cynically assuming the worst. Choosing depth on a few things over superficial breadth on everything.
Choosing silence sometimes over adding to the spectacle. Integrity over instant reaction.
Exactly. Because in the end, the news isn't just this tool for knowing the world out there.
What is it then?
It's also a mirror for helping us know ourselves and our place within that world. Healing our relationship with news isn't just about fixing the media, it's about reclaiming something of our own humanity within this overwhelming flow of information.